All right, welcome to quest number 2. This one, it's another writing quest, but our focus this time is not on a personal reflective essay, but rather on a narrative. So as we go through this, we're going to be talking a lot about narrative. And narrative, if you're not sure, it's just an English teacher way of saying story, right? Beginning, middle, end, things happen, characters, plots, all that kind of stuff. We'll get into that. But where we start actually at level 1 for this quest is trying to answer the question of why. Why do people tell stories? And it turns out it has something to do with our brains, and not in the zombie I want to eat your brains kind of way, but rather the way that our brains are wired. We like hearing stories. We are a narrative people. So storytelling is one of the most basic, fundamental things. It's probably the very first human art form. So in level 1, there's some TED Talks and there's a few short narratives, not because they are particularly, cultural, but because they can help get at that question of why. Why do we even tell stories? Level 2 is going to get into the question of why it's important that we tell everybody's story, and why it's important that people are allowed to tell their own stories. You might remember from Quest 1 that there was a level where you had to talk about somebody's misconceptions or misperceptions or stereotypes about you. And maybe you asked yourself, why did this person have this stereotype of me? And it was probably because they had not heard your story. They had not heard your side of the story. I mean, the whole thing that makes a stereotype is that it comes from somebody else's version of you. So that's what level 2 is all about. And we actually get into a set of stories from the country of Iran that are going to help us sort of dig into that idea of why it's dangerous to leave people's voices out of it. There is only one optional level in this quest, and that's 2A. And it sort of asks the question, all right, if everybody should be allowed to tell their own story, does that mean that all narratives should be first person? Does it mean all narratives should be third person? Does the point of view of a narrative matter? And then level 3, and let me tell you, level 3 is kind of amazing because I'm throwing, a dozen, 15, 16 different narratives at you. It's all reading. Level 3 is really all reading. But you're reading some short stories, you're reading some narrative poems, you're reading some memoir, you're reading some graphic novels. And the idea is that before you get to the embedded assessment at the end of this quest, which is you writing your own narrative, you want to make an informed decision about what kind of narrative is going to be best for you to write. Do you want to write a memoir? Do you want to write a short story? Do you want to do something else? So we're taking a look at what we call the genre conventions. That is, how is dialogue in a graphic novel different from dialogue in a short story, is different from dialogue in a narrative poem. Level 4 then is starting to narrow down. If level 3 is about figuring out what kind of narrative you want to tell, level 4 is about helping you narrow down what cultural perspective you want to show in that narrative. It asks questions like, what is it about a person's culture that's worth sharing? Maybe you like popular music. That could be part of your cultural identity, but there's a reason why we call it popular music, right? Everybody likes popular music. So is that necessarily the best thing to share as part of your cultural identity? Now, this is the part that you're going to love, which is that for both level 3 and level 4, there is no written assignment. You don't have to, there's no essay. There's no whole bunch of short answer questions. Level 4 has some short answer questions, but at the end of level 3, you're filling out a chart. At the end of level 4, you're sitting down to have a conversation with me. And part of that is because the writing in level 5, I want you to take it seriously. I want you to have the time and the strength in terms of your writing muscles. I don't want them to be tired because I want that narrative for the embedded assessment. I want that to be really good. And even though you get your choice of what cultural perspective to show, you get your choice of what narrative genre to write in, you even get your choice of whether it's a true story that you tell or one that you make up. The writing needs to be taken seriously. If you want to score advanced, you do have to write a really good narrative. So let's actually take a look at the rubric for level 5. Okay, yes, this being the rubric for level 5, it does have like a million checks on the checklist for: have you been doing the academic vocabulary? Have you been doing the vocabulary from literature? Are you writing answers in your Springboard book? Are you doing graphic organizers? So those are there. And you definitely want to make sure that you're keeping up with those throughout the level so that when you turn in your binder with level 5, it's all there and you can score advanced on these standards. But it's the narrative standard in the middle that I want to spend some time on right now. You will notice that the narrative row right there has only 3 checkboxes. There are only 3 things that I'm looking for. And you might be thinking to yourself, whoa, self, that's going to be super easy if I only have to do 3 things. But it's not. Let's look at them more closely. My narrative effectively conveys a cultural perspective. So when you sit down and have the conversation with me at the end of level 4, we're going to talk about what that cultural perspective is that you want to get across. It may be something related to your ethnicity. It may be related to your religion, maybe related to your hobbies, arts, music, sports. It may be something else that I'm not even thinking of. But it should be something that is part of your cultural identity. It should be something that is important to you. And in your narrative, it needs to come across clearly. One of the things that you will notice when you are looking at whether it's the Iran stories in level 2 or all of the different kinds of narratives that you're reading in level 3 is that I've selected ones that do have this cultural perspective, that do have a way to look at the world that is related to the writer's cultural identity. So I want you to pay attention to those things as you are reading. How does each writer get their cultural identity or their cultural point of view across in the narrative that they write? My narrative closely follows genre conventions for plot, characters, and settings. So by the time you're done with this quest, you will have formally considered 6 different kinds of narratives: short stories, memoirs, narrative poems, videos, oral storytelling, and graphic novels. Now, does that mean that you are limited only to those 6 genres? Of course not. Those are just 6 genres that I thought we could explore as a whole class, right? But maybe there's some kind of storytelling that is much more personal to you and that you would rather investigate, rather get into than the 6 that I have picked out for you. For example, I know that on the Faces book, they now have this thing up at the top that says your story. I don't really get that because I'm an old and I don't understand how the Faces book works. But maybe you do like the Facebook story or the Snap story and you want to work with me on crafting a rubric for you for that particular thing. I'm also thinking of something like traditional Hmong story quilts, where I would not expect you to quilt an entire quilt, but certainly planning a story quilt. So what would go here and how would that narrative play out? And again, I don't know a lot about that kind of narrative, so you and I would need to sit down and talk about it before you went ahead with it. But I am actually really kind of excited to see what other genres of storytelling you are interested in bringing into this class, because this assignment, this whole level, this whole quest, the whole class from beginning to end, August to May, the whole thing would not be worth it if you didn't have an opportunity to bring yourself into it. So if there's something other than one of those 6 genres, please talk to me about it and let's do it. Let's make it happen. But specifically, the way you show your characters, the way you develop the plot, all of that, it has to be consistent with the way other texts from that genre do it. So when you're writing a narrative poem, you will have seen some examples and you'll have the ability to go back through narrative poetry from Quest 1, you'll have seen examples for how those narrative poems show a plot or show characterization. And your narrative poem should kind of follow those same patterns. That's what this checkbox on the rubric is all about. And there's another one that's almost exactly like it. My narrative closely follows genre conventions for dialogue, including correct punctuation and paragraphing where appropriate. Now, this is the specific example that I was using earlier when I talked about how short stories do dialogue different from poems, do dialogue differently from graphic novels. So when you are writing your narrative, you are going to closely follow the models for dialogue that you have seen throughout this quest. There are 2 more standards on this level 5 rubric that are going to be scored, or that I'm going to use your narrative to score. One of them is conventions, grammar. Are you spelling things right? Are you punctuating things right? Do you have sentence sense? Unless, of course, where it's appropriate for, a character maybe doesn't speak in complete sentences, or a character uses slang or something like that's okay. But just generally, are you writing it well in terms of the mechanics? But there's also this standard. If I have completed more than one version of this narrative in different points of view, the versions effectively show the limitations of using just one of those points of view. Remember level 2A in this quest, which is the only optional level, but that level was all about, does it matter what point of view my narrative is in? Does it matter if there's an I telling the story or if it's in third person? So what you can do for some credit, this is a completely different standard that's not covered for people who aren't doing this. So you're getting credit in a new standard here. But you can write a version of your narrative that is in first person and then rewrite it in third person and take a look at what the differences are. Does the point of view, does it change how much information the audience gets specifically and how much they have to infer from what you have written? Does it change the way the dialogue happens? Does it change the pace of the story? So writing those 2 different versions can get you some credit on this other standard. And that is just about it for this introduction to the quest. Of course, along the way, there is vocabulary. There is some graphic novel stuff, some stuff that you will do in your Springboard book, and all of that will be turned in with your binder when you submit level 5. There are separate introductory videos for each one of the levels, 1 through 4, including 2A. So take a look at those if you need some additional guidance. And as always, you can ask me about anything. And if you have any ideas for how to fulfill the requirements of this quest or any of the levels on the quest, besides what I've asked you to do, talk to me about it. The whole idea of this class, as I said, is that you are going to bring yourself into it. All right? Good luck.